Let me invite you to be turning to Deuteronomy chapter 30. Deuteronomy chapter 30. And I'll ask you to join me at verse 19 in just a moment. Again, Deuteronomy chapter 30. What we find here is God, through His appointed leader Moses, preparing that second generation of His chosen people, the Old Testament Israel, as they were about to enter the promised land of Canaan. And what we find here at verse 19 is God setting before them a choice of paramount importance. It's interesting how He introduces this. He calls heaven and earth to record against you. In other words, He says, if we need witnesses to what I am about to propose to you, let heaven and earth give their record. So look there, verse 19. Again, this is God speaking through Moses, His spokesman. I call heaven and earth to record this day against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore, choose life, that both thou and thy seed may live. I don't know about you, but hearing those choices, who would not choose life over death? Again, hearing those choices, who would not choose blessing rather than cursing? And friends, if you would like to get a greater appreciation for what those blessings and cursings were, go back and read chapters 28 and 29. But, very important here, God urges them to make those choices which we assume all would make. Choose life. Choose blessings. Now, please appreciate that God had just got done informing them on how to make that choice. The choice that He urges them to make. The choice that we think all would have chosen to make. So back up and join me at verse 15 and let's read down through to verse 19 again. See, I have set before thee this day life and death, or good, and death and evil. In that I command thee this day to love the Lord thy God, to walk in His ways, to keep His commandments and His statutes and His judgments, that thou mayest live and multiply. And the Lord thy God shall bless thee in the land whither thou goest to possess it. But if thine heart turn away, so that thou wilt not hear, but shall be drawn away and worship other gods and serve them, I denounce unto you this day that you shall surely perish, and that you shall not prolong your days upon the land whither thou passest over Jordan to go to possess it. Now, our verse, I call heaven and earth to record this day against you, that I've set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose life, that both thou and thy seed may live. Again, He reminds them how to do that thou mayest love the Lord thy God, and that thou mayest obey His voice, and that thou mayest cleave unto Him, for He is thy life and the length of thy days, that thou mayest dwell in the land which the Lord sware unto thy fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give them. Now, let me kind of offer a reason that I bring this historic episode to our attention. And that is because, here's the truth of the matter, God continues to set before us choices of paramount importance. And then having set those choices before us, He urges us to make the right decision. Friends, the decision that we would anticipate all would make if they are thinking correctly, if they are perceiving properly. Life or death, which would you choose? Blessing or cursing, which would you choose? How about wisdom or misery? Which would you choose? It's interesting. This notion of wisdom that we find in the series for our sermons, this notion of wisdom really well corresponds to the historic episode that we have just considered. Because you see, earlier in this same book of Deuteronomy, please listen to what God through Moses explained to His people of Israel. Back in Deuteronomy 4, verse 5, beginning, "Behold, I have taught you statutes and judgments, even as the Lord my God commanded me, that you should do so in the land whither you go to possess it." Notice, "Keep therefore and do them, for this is your wisdom and understanding in the sight of the nations, which shall hear all these statutes, and they will say, Surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people." You see, wisdom for Israel was demonstrated by their hearing and doing God's commands that He had given them. Their obedience to God's wise counsel would bring for them life and blessing. And for them to obey that word would prevent their experiencing death and cursing. But you see, again, the reality is that's not just true for Israel of old. That's still true today. That fundamental, that universal truth is at the very heart of the current series that we have been engaged in which we are being urged to choose wisdom so that we can prevent misery. Misery. Now, our series is centered not in the book of Deuteronomy, but in the book of Ecclesiastes, particularly Ecclesiastes chapter 8. If you want to be turning over there so we can resume, invite you to do that. But please understand, even though we're looking at Ecclesiastes chapter 8 and kind of using its contents for our, the basic skeleton and format of this series, please understand, it has as its backdrop the entire book of Ecclesiastes. Because that book of the Bible identifies for us the only true wise course for living life. That course that would bring life and blessing. A rewarding life, a gratifying, a meaningful life, a contented life. And only by choosing that true wise course for living this life can we prevent death and cursing. Or we might say experiencing meaninglessness in our lives, discontent, vanity, and yes, misery. You know what it is? It's the same as it was for Israel of old. That only true wise course for living this life is to hear and obey God's wise counsel for this life. So please appreciate, as was true for Israel of old, God continues to urge us, choose wisdom so that you can avoid misery. And just as was true for Israel of old, that choice is made by hearing and doing God's will for our lives. Friends, true wisdom for this life is summed up in Solomon's conclusion presented at the end of this book of Ecclesiastes. Hear the conclusion of the whole matter: fear God, keep His commandments, Isn't that what God told Israel to do? Fear God, keep His commandments. This is the whole duty of man, for God will bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. So, God still says, I set before you a choice. Wisdom or misery? Again, which would you choose? I mean, just common sense, which would you choose? Wisdom, right? And yet, how many people choose misery? So how do we do that? Well, go back to Ecclesiastes chapter 8. Because in this chapter again, here we have Solomon saying, choose wisdom. Choose wisdom, verse 1. Go down to verse 5 at the end of the verse. A wise man's heart discerns both time and judgment, because to every purpose there is time and judgment. Therefore the misery of man is great upon him. Friends, we invite misery upon ourselves. Just as Israel would have chosen death, chosen cursing, which they did, by refusing to hear and obey God's will. We do the same. When we try to use some alternate purpose for living life than that which is discerned by or prescribed by our Creator, it's going to result in meaninglessness and misery of life. So, what does that look like? See, that's really what we're doing here. We're trying to take from Ecclesiastes chapter 8, well, what does that look like? How can we choose wisdom so that we can prevent misery from being introduced into our lives? Well, again, the basic answer is hear and obey God. As our Creator, as the architect of life, He knows how best to live this life. And when we think we can substitute His prescribed wisdom for our own, well, we're going to invite misery. So how do we do that? Well, first of all, we said from verses 2 down to verse 5, it is by accepting authority. That's where true wisdom begins. A reverential awe for God's sovereign right to rule our lives. That's where true wisdom begins. But then that grows into another recognition, not just recognizing God's sovereign authority, but since He is the one who ordains all power, all authority here on earth, well, then I need to accept even those delegated authorities as ordained by God. The government, parents, husband, community leaders, elders in the church. It would appear to me that God intended one of the purposes for this construct that we find in every facet of our earthly life is so that man recognizes the need to learn submission. It begins with submission to God. But then that submission, accepting authority, should again be true of all of these areas. When we fail to do that, I'm just telling you, you're going to introduce misery into your life. Choose wisdom. All right, but now for the second one. And this one is beginning there in Ecclesiastes chapter 8 and beginning with about, verse 7 and 8, basically. And that is this, friends, choosing wisdom will prevent misery by expecting an end. Expecting an end. Now, our own experiences, our own observation should yield this wisdom, right? We all should recognize, just as occupants of this earth, we should expect there's going to be an end to this earthly life. But this conclusion is further attested to by true wisdom. Remember, true wisdom is God's revelation to man. And that revelation provides for us the narrative of the human family. See, it's not just limited to my experiences and your observations. No, listen to true wisdom. Because God's revelation gives us the narrative of the entire human family from its first members. And you know what that teaches us? we ought to expect an end. Every member of the human family should know and expect there's an end coming to this earthly life. True wisdom that demands expecting this end of earthly life. Why? Because God's revelation informs us of what Adam and Eve did, so that we need to expect this end. Adam and Eve's transgression in the garden separated them from the tree of life that would have perpetuated their life, so that they would not have faced physical death. But because of their choices in the garden and God separating them from the tree of life, guess what? And that wasn't just true of Adam and Eve. That was true of all of their posterity. Everyone coming after Adam and Eve, who would belong to the human family, they all were separated from the tree of life, and that guarantees physical death is going to come. We should expect an end to our time here on earth. Friends, coupled with this compelling historical evidence, well, God's Word repeatedly reminds man to wisely expect an end as an earthly traveler. I mean, just think about the first genealogy. I know we don't like to read those, right? Those long lists of names we can't pronounce. But the first one, Genesis chapter 5, not long after the beginning of the Bible, guess what? It's replete with every entry, and he died. There's one exception. There's one exception in that genealogy. And it truly is an anomaly. Enoch. After his entry, it does not say, and he died. It says God took him. But then you come to the Psalms, and that's a favorite section of Scripture, even among those who aren't necessarily religious people. Many people have read some of the Psalms and listened to the Psalms set forth this very pointed question. Psalm 89, verse 48, what man is he that lives and shall not see death? Doesn't that urge us to expect an end? He goes on to ask, shall he, man, deliver his soul from the hand of the grave? And once again, there's only one other person to whom that doesn't apply. Enoch and Elijah. And guess what? In neither case was it their own hand that delivered them from death. It was God who took them. He took Enoch and he took Elijah. But Psalm 89 verse 48 should find us expecting an end. And then when we come to the New Testament, it explains this expected end of earthly life should actually be viewed as a divine appointment that we're all going to keep. Hebrews 9:27, and as it is appointed unto men once to die. We ought to expect it. Now, joining those and many other scriptural reminders, let's add Ecclesiastes chapter 8. Look at Ecclesiastes chapter 8. Begin with me there in verse 7. For he knoweth not that which shall be, for who can tell him when it shall be? There is no man that hath power over the Spirit to retain the Spirit. Neither hath he power in the day of death. And there is no discharge in that war. Friends, the language of this verse, verse 8, powerfully presents man's inability to circumvent the expected end. Solomon reminds us, man, we are powerless against physical death. Ricky, there's an interesting metaphor here used relative to war. Solomon says, this is a battle from which an individual cannot be discharged. Discharged. literally defined release from service or duty. And having been in the military myself, I understand the significance of a discharge. Having served in the United States Air Force, I had the hope of one day being honorably discharged to conclude my service in the military. And I'm thankful I was able to do that. Tried to do my best to keep my nose clean when I was in the military. So I got an honorable discharge. But do you understand the significance here? Solomon says, death is a battle. Death is a service, a duty from which there is no discharge. You see, it's very unlike the current U.S. military scenario where you first choose to enlist. I volunteered. Guess what? You don't volunteer to live, do you? Did you have any say in that? So very unlike our military service, when we think of here the word discharge, you don't volunteer. No. You get life. And then Solomon says, and you shouldn't be anticipating a discharge from its expected end. Death. So friends, you enter into this life, this battle upon physical birth, and you cannot obtain a discharge from it. The expected end. Now, I'm not going to take time to go through this, but I have a very worn version of the pulpit commentary. And sometimes it provides great historical, kind of background that I would not have known. And it was talking about how some ancient cultures would have truly understood this metaphor. This idea there's no discharge from war. In fact, the pulpit commentary offers two historical, documented events. One had to do with the Persian king Darius. The other one had to do with the Persian king Xerxes. It names two fathers. One father came and said to the king Darius, I have 3 sons. Will you leave one so he doesn't have to go to war? And Darius said, I'll leave him. And he killed him right in before his eyes. He said, now he stays home with you. The other one was a father. He says, please, Xerxes, allow my oldest son to stay with me. Apparently, Xerxes went off in a rage, and he says, he doesn't have to go to war. And again, he killed him before his father's eyes and divided his body in half and put him on either side of the road that army marched out of as a solemn reminder, you don't get a discharge. There are no exemptions. So if you had that as a military upbringing, can you understand Solomon saying, death, there's no discharge. There's no exemptions. This is an end you ought to expect. That's what true wisdom demands. But notice, verse 7, the previous verse, attests to another wise recognition pertaining to this expecting an end. And that is, we do not know when it's coming. Listen to verse 7 again. For he knows not that which shall be, for who can tell him when it shall be? Friends, I know we all understand this reality, but I call it to our attention. Death is not a respecter of persons or age. We all know that, don't we? Accidents, illnesses, natural disasters, tragedies of all sorts claim our loved ones at various stages of their lives. And we ourselves are not immune to any of those at any time. You remember I said the Bible speaks of death as an appointment that we're all going to keep? Hebrews 9, verse 27. But, once again, kind of like the war metaphor, maybe appointment, in a way, kind of loses some of its power for us. Because how do some people treat other appointments that they make here on earth? They just don't show up, right? Others will call and cancel. Some will try to reschedule or postpone their appointments. You can't do that with this appointment. In fact, you don't even know when this one's going to be. So you can't go home and write it on your calendar. You can't get a card, an appointment card that says, on this day, at this time, you're going to meet this appointment. No. True wisdom tells us we don't know when this one's going to be. And you know what? Even though death is a universal and daily experience, it still brings emotional challenges when it visits our homes, doesn't it? And especially is that the case when it comes unexpectedly, without any warning. Friends, those emotional challenges can be extremely difficult, even devastating. I'm sure I've shared this one with you before. But my mom was with her youngest sister, and they were out to eat. And my Aunt Janet got a call on her cell phone while they were in the restaurant. It was Hershey Medical Center. Confirming who she was, they said, "We're sorry to report that James died." Now, James was her husband's name. It's also her son's name. We always called him Jimmy. His given name was James. See, he and his dad had been on the golf course that day. He was 47 years old. He was a lot thinner than I was. I mean, just a strappy young man. Recently moved back out of the Northeast to come and live close to his parents, work there, and he fell dead in his father's arms of a massive heart attack. My aunt never recovered from that. I mean, I'm sure it would have been difficult if it was her husband, but her oldest son? In a period of 8 years, my aunt died. For all intent and purposes, without any mental faculties left. It's difficult. But true wisdom teaches us we need to expect and we should not think that it's necessarily as far off as we would want it to be. Listen again to the words, who can tell when it shall be? See, sometimes it's going to be a lot sooner than what we ever anticipated or wanted. Very quickly, true wisdom not only dictates expecting an end and recognizing that it can come at any time, but true wisdom demands also that we recognize, contemplate, and prepare for what accompanies that end. Judgment. Judgment. Again, I remind us of Hebrews 9 and verse 27 because I've not yet read the entire verse. And as it is appointed unto men once to die, but after this, the judgment. You see, like death, judgment is a divine appointment that we all will keep. Once again, friends, do we perceive God's wanting us to wisely discern those components of purpose, time, and judgment in our approach to understanding life? We called attention to this. I believe it was in our introductory lesson. But if you go back to verses 5 and 6, he'll talk about that. At the end of verse 5, a wise man's heart discerneth both time and judgment, because to every purpose there is time and judgment. Friends, Solomon's conclusion presents this so clearly. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God, keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God shall bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. Friends, choosing wisely to approach life with this divine perspective allows me to be impressed with these three important realities: time, purpose, judgment. Whatever time that I am privileged to occupy this earth, it is for the purpose of preparing to stand before God in judgment, so that He can welcome me in to His eternal presence. See, wisdom, true wisdom, God's revelation to man, wants us to understand those vital components: time, purpose, judgment. And if we fail to do that, we're inviting misery into our lives, not only now, but for eternity. Misery. We have to embrace the truth, friends, that this life is a temporal period of preparation. The Bible speaks of life as a pilgrimage, a journey. It's just a temporary passing through. We sing the song, "This world is not my home. I'm just passing through." We have to embrace that. This life and understanding our purpose for it, I believe, was typified and foreshadowed in Israel's 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. Because listen to what God through Moses tells again His Old Testament people with regards to their purpose for why God led them through the wilderness. Listen to it. "And thou shalt remember all the way which the Lord thy God led thee these 40 years in the wilderness, to humble thee and to prove thee and to know what was in your heart, whether you will keep His commandments or not." Friends, may I submit that same purpose is why we have life today. It is a means by which God humbles us, proves us, tests us to know what is in our heart. Namely, whether we will keep His commandments or choose to rebel and go our own separate way. I don't know if you've ever heard of this, but I've heard preachers, I've read it at other places, that life is called the vale of soul making. Vale just as the valley of soul making. I hope you appreciate that. Life, friends, is a proving ground. It's a period of testing. It's a period of preparation. It's a period of which we are making our souls, cultivating who we are. And when you hear that kind of terminology, doesn't it infer that you expect an end? Kind of like classroom, Tanya. They're going through that classroom expecting there's going to be an end. There's going to be a final exam in which the teacher, Tanya, is going to determine how they did. You see, the veil of soul-making earthly life should have us expecting an end. There's going to come a time when we're going to learn of and hear the results of God's testing us. You see, He's the one who's administering the test. He's the one who has given us life. He's the one who has informed us what this life is all about. And so now, through this life, He is proving me. He's testing me. Mike, what is in your heart? Will you choose to fear me and keep my commandments, knowing there's a judgment day coming? Or do you choose an alternate purpose for life. Well, once again, we got through the positive part of this. We didn't see the misery. Lord willing, and I hate to devote an entire lesson to misery, but misery can be brought into our lives if we are unwilling to expect an end. God says to Israel, I set before you a choice. Life or death. Blessing or cursing. Today, God continues to set before us a choice. Wisdom or misery? Now again, just hearing the choices, I think everyone in their right mind would say, hey, I'll take wisdom. I certainly don't want to invite misery into my life. And yet understanding what that demands, recognizing the practical application of that, finds sadly many, like Israel of old, hearing life and death, choosing death. Hearing blessing and cursing, choosing cursing. How many people today hear God say, I set before you a choice, wisdom or misery. Now, God says, choose wisdom. He urges us with all that He has, choose wisdom. Yet sadly, many will choose misery. Because it all comes down to time, purpose, and judgment. See, wisdom demands a recognition my time here on earth is limited. I should be expecting an end. The time that I do have, I need to understand, is for the purpose of fearing God, keeping His commandments, prove that my heart truly is one that can be accepted by God, who is found faithfully trying to do His will, all the while knowing that when that expected end arrives, following it will be a judgment in which God will give His rendering. The song we are going to sing is Prepare. Prepare to meet that day. If we can help you in any way in better understanding the purpose of life, better choosing wisdom rather than inviting misery into your lives, it begins by obeying the gospel of Jesus Christ. If you know what that entails and you need help doing it, call on us. If you want to study more, please let us know.